This is a continuation of the interview with Mr. Robert Mott on September 30th, 2006 at the Pennington home in Emporia. And Bob, when we shut down this morning, we had gotten you out of limbo in the airborne and to, I believe it was Camp McCall, North Carolina.
Correct.
Would you like to pick up there?
I will. I went up to Camp McCall, North Carolina from the Alabama area at Fort Benning and was assigned to the 515th Parachute Infantry Regiment, a new regiment being formed. And most of the time up there we were doing field maneuvers. I had one interesting assignment at Camp McCall that I'd like to mention. It was the assignment, I had two as a matter of fact. I had one as the post-prison officer running the stockade for a while. That was not good duty, and I got through with that as quickly as I could. Not a desirous task that I had, but I had that for a couple of months along with some other duties. But the story I wanted to tell you was about a requirement that was laid upon me to prepare about 100 enlisted paratroopers for replacements overseas. And the task was to get them ready, both mentally and physically, to get them organized, to get their records in shape, to get their uniforms in shape. In short, it was a task of getting 100 men ready to go overseas into combat. I didn't have a requirement to get them combat ready from the standpoint of training, but to get them ready to ship overseas. And the task concluded when we moved the troops from Camp McCall by train to Fort Holabird, Maryland, which at that time was a port of embarkation. It isn't now, and but it was near Baltimore, Maryland, and that was the task. The train that we took up was the Seaboard Line, and we got into the Union Station in Washington, D.C., a cavernous building, and of course trains were big back in those days. They were chugging everywhere, and the people running the train, the conductor, came to me and said, "We have to do some switching here in the yards, and we want all your troops off the train and into the station for a period of about 4 hours." And I thought, what am I going to do with the 100 paratroopers getting ready to go overseas and knowing they're going overseas in the Union Station in Washington, D.C. About that time, one of the enlisted men came up and said, "Lieutenant, this is probably going to be our last chance to have any free time in the United States. Would you be willing to dismiss us and let us go if I make a commitment that all 100 of us will return after in time to catch the train in about 4 hours?" And I thought about that, and I dismissed them. I let them go. I was working with a medical officer, Captain Kennedy, and another lieutenant. The three of us were the three officers on duty, and after I had made that decision, the other lieutenant came over to me and said, "Are you crazy? Are you crazy to let those men go? Half of them won't show up in 4 hours. They'll be AWOL all over the place." Well, of course, at that point, I had some second thoughts. To make a long story short, in 4 hours, all 100 returned in time for us to catch the train out to Fort Holabird. Evidence, I think, of the airborne spirit and the fact that even though these men had volunteered, knew they were going overseas, they met the responsibility that we had. From McCall, I myself became a replacement officer in the spring of 1944. I was told that I would be a replacement. That's what the 515th was doing. It was shaping people up to get them ready, and in dribbles and drabs, groups of 100, 200, small groups of replacements, they were being shipped overseas. In May, I was given leave for 10 days, went home to Emporia, and visited my family. By that time, I'd purchased a car with another fella who lived in West Monroe, Louisiana. I bought out his half of the car, took it home, gave the car to my mother with the title, got my will ready, which they required you to do, and went back down to Camp McCall. About 104 officers were in this packet. There were 4 captains in the group, and the rest of us were first and second lieutenants. We went from McCall to Camp Shanks, New York, which is up the Hudson River from New York City, but it's on the, somehow when you get down into the city, you're on the Jersey side of the river, and you have to take a ferry across into Manhattan. And at the Shanks, at Camp Shanks, all they were doing were running troops through there and getting ready to load on ships in the New York harbor. And we were supposed to go out in about mid-May. For some reason that I never understood and never knew, our shipment of 104 officers was delayed. It was delayed for about 2 weeks. And during that time, since we'd gone through all the training, all our records were ready, we were ready to go, we just literally had free time. So the group was sort of on its own, and we spent a great deal of time in New York City. And nothing particularly unusual happened, with one exception, which I might mention. That was on June the 4th. 2 friends of mine and I were at the Polo Grounds, the old stadium where the New York Giants used to play baseball, and it was a Sunday afternoon, and we decided that we'd take in my first Major League Baseball game. And we went to the game, went up on the subway and went to the game. Sometime about in the middle of the game, 4th, 5th, 6th inning, along in there, the public address announcer came on the air and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the invasion of Europe has begun by the Allied forces. Could we all stand and have a moment of silence in prayer for their success?" Words to that effect. And we all stood, and the crowd was silent. Sitting right behind us was a naval officer, and I don't know his rank, but he was by himself, and I think had enough brass on to be convinced that he was probably an admiral, although I'm not sure about that. At any rate, as we finished our moment of silence, he reached down and touched us on the shoulder, and he said, God, boys, don't you wish you were over there with them?" And I will be perfectly frank to tell you that no, I didn't wish that I were over there with them. That was not my feeling or my thought or my desire at all. I had no desire to be in a combat situation. It turned out, after the ball game was over, which I think the Pittsburgh Pirates won 8-7, if I remember correctly, we took the subway, went downtown to Times Square, where the big electric sign was running around the building, the Times building, or whatever building it was. And we look up at the sign expecting to see news flashes about the invasion of the continent by the Allied forces. There's not a word about it. Instead, what we see on the marquee is the fact that the Allied forces had conquered Rome that day, June the 4th. The Allied forces moving up the peninsula. So, as was our custom, we found a bar and went in to the Astor Hotel bar and asked the bartender, "What about the invasion?" And he said, that was a false alarm. Somebody made a mistake. It was a false start. I found out much later by reading literature about it that a British female soldier had supposedly transmitted something by teletype which had caused this information to get out. At any rate, it was anticlimactic. We went back to the barracks. A couple of days later, on Tuesday, I was in the latrine shaving pretty early in the morning. Not bright and early, but pretty early in the morning, and another officer comes in and says to me, the invasion has begun. And I said something like, yeah, that's what I heard on Sunday. And he said, no, this is it. This is serious. The radio is filled with it. Later that day, we got orders to get all of our gear ready to go. Around 5, 6 o'clock in the evening, we boarded a train that took us down to Manhattan, but again on the New Jersey side of the Hudson River, and we took a ferry across, and we moved just by walking off the ferry. We moved to the Queen Mary, which was docked there, and by 7, 8 o'clock at night, we were all on board the Queen Mary, and we knew for sure we were headed overseas. And we went overseas, and it took about 5 days. By June the 11th, we actually moved out of the harbor in New York, past the Statue of Liberty, on the morning of the 7th, and I believe it was by the 11th when we arrived at Greenock, Scotland.
How was your trip?
Where we docked. It wasn't too bad. The officers, interestingly enough, were still being served in the same dining rooms where the passengers on the Queen Mary had served. We only got 2 meals a day. We got breakfast and we got dinner. And you ate them at very odd hours because it was virtually a perpetual motion operation to feed groups of officers and then have another seating and another seating. There were stewards there. There was nice cutlery. There were tablecloths. Very pleasant mealtime atmosphere. I can't say the same for the sleeping quarters. 6 of us were in a closet that was probably 8 or 10 feet wide and had 3 bunks on either side of a very narrow aisle, so that we were stacked, 2 on the floor, 2 in the middle, and 2 in the top bunk. And I, for reasons unknown to me, got the top bunk, and it was so stuffy and close in there, I could not have survived if there hadn't been an air vent right by my head. I didn't sleep very much on that trip, very confining. The sleeping quarters were bad, but the food service was good. I remember at breakfast one time they served oranges, and I said to somebody, I don't want my orange, do you want it? The steward said to me, in a British accent, old chap, you better take the orange. It'll probably be the last one you see until you get home again. And he was right. I never saw another orange all the time, about 11 months that I was overseas. But our trip was smooth. We weren't in a convoy. They moved quickly and directly. By that time, the American forces had good control of the submarine warfare in the Atlantic, and we just moved across swiftly to Greenock. We boarded British trains in Greenock. I remember going through the town of Crewe, K-R-E-W, and we find ourselves in near Nottingham. That's where the airborne divisions who had jumped on D-Day, the day that we left the States, the 82nd Airborne Division and the 101st Airborne Division, who had been on the continent for a long, long time, we moved into their vacated camps. Other officer groups came along, other replacement officers, and hordes of enlisted men. And we did some routine training there, waiting for the bulk. We thought the bulk of the troops that would be coming back from Normandy in the 82nd and 101st.
How long were you in England then?
In England, in total, I was in England over 6 months.
Over 6 months.
In total, yeah.
Did you have much relationship with the English people during that time?
Quite a bit, yeah, quite a bit. In Nottingham is a pretty good-sized city. I don't know the population, but we were out in a rural area in small villages, and they had middle what do they call it, double daytime,
Double daylight.
double daylight time, thank you. And we had an opportunity to go to the pubs around there. The British were very cordial. They did make it quite plain to us that they were glad that the invasion had started and that the bulk of the troops had left. They were pleased about that, but they were very hospitable, very nice to us. We didn't make any particularly close friends, and we weren't in very many British homes, but on the streets and in the pubs and at the theaters, the cinema, and that type of thing, a very cordial atmosphere. The Yanks and the Brits got along fine in that particular area. Not much happened. We made a practice jump during the time we were there. No particular tactical or strategic purpose, but rather just a jump to see if we were all still up to jumping. We didn't do an exercise. We just went up, jumped, landed, and walked away from it. No exercise. And we had a huge review. This review was held sometime in late July or early August. Now, the review didn't take place until after the surviving troops from Normandy came back to their base camps in England.
The airborne troops.
The airborne troops. The airborne troops, right. The airborne military doctrine calls for a condition that after you jump into a combat situation and you have maintained or established contact and maintained contact with ground forces off of the beach or wherever else they might be coming from, once that link up has been established, supposedly the airborne troops are to be withdrawn and brought back to base immediately. That didn't happen in Normandy, nor did it happen in any other American airdrops in the European theater of operations. It was July the 14th when the 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment, to which I'd been assigned, part of the 82nd Airborne Division, came back, the 2nd Battalion, 507th Parachute Infantry. The remaining, that battalion would probably have 1,000 to 1,200 men. The remaining element of that battalion was contained in one of the red double-decker buses. So help me. It pulled up outside of the camp one day and they said, the 507th is coming back. One double-decker bus came in and the soldiers got off of that bus. Now
you mean that was all that was left?
That was all that was left.
The rest were
That
dead?
was all that was left.
Wounded?
No,
or?
they weren't. They were not all dead. Casualty rate was high. What happened was some were still missing in action, some were in hospitals, and as time went by, they slowly trickled back. So the attrition overall was not as bad as I described it, but that was still on that one day. It was a particular shock. Now, don't let me overstate that to say that that was the whole content of the battalion, personnel-wise. That isn't so. Others came back, and the strength with the replacements and the other returnees over a period of time got back to 100%.
Did this give you any pause as to your
Yes, it
volunteering
did.
for airborne?
Yes, I thought that I didn't think about the doctrine about what the Army policy was supposed to be, but I thought that's a shocking casualty rate. Although, as I've explained, it wasn't quite as extreme as I described with the bus. There was another return element that came back to flesh out the men of the troops. Short time after the 82nd Airborne and 101st Airborne came back, they were both reconstituted, but a decision was made to take the 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment out of the 82nd Airborne and move it to a newly arrived division, the 17th Airborne Division. My recollection is there were in all, I believe, 6 airborne divisions, the 82nd and 101st, the two famous ones. The 17th Airborne Division came overseas. The 13th Airborne Division came to the European Theater of Operations, but never went into combat. They got into the war so late that they were not needed or required, and there was an 11th Airborne Division that was deployed to the South Pacific. The South Pacific terrain and the island hopping concept was not particularly conducive to airborne operations. At any rate, they moved the 507th into the 17th Airborne Division. Our division commander was, the name escapes me. I'm having General Miley, of a long family of soldiers and fighters. And General Miley was from the South, from Mississippi, I believe.
Spell. Spell.
Pardon?
Spell.
M-I-L-E-Y. And his first name escapes me right now, but his last name was Miley, M-I-L-E-Y. Our regimental commander was Edson Raff, E-D-S-O-N, Raff, R-A-F-F. Raff was a short colonel. Miley was a 2-star general and had been very active in the airborne for a long, long time. He was an airborne veteran. He hadn't made a lot of jumps, but he'd been active in the activating of the airborne school and the parachute school and so forth and so on. And our battalion commander was a Lieutenant Colonel Charles Timmies. Charles, normal spelling, Timmies, T-I-M-M-E-S. And he looked like a school teacher. He, and I don't mean to denigrate school teachers, but he was not a gung-ho leader type at all. But he was a very efficient and caring commander. And I was always glad that I served under Lieutenant Colonel Timmies. And a little story about him later in life, by the way, that I can relate to. So those were our officers. I can't remember who was commanding, who were the company commanders, except with one exception. That was a Captain Oliver Case, C-A-S-E. He was a Florida person, and Casey and I had known each other for quite a while. And he was a captain. I was a first lieutenant. We got along well, and I turned out to be his company executive officer in E Company of the 507th. And so we marked our time. We would do some night problems. We didn't do anything in the way of close order drill or the basic material. We were usually out in the field doing deployments, and they spent a lot of time putting the emphasis on how to fight in the hedgerows, because in Normandy the hedgerows had been a tremendous problem for ground troops, not so much for the airborne, but just for all infantry and all the tankers. You couldn't deploy and maneuver tankers very well, and the narrow roads and the high embankment of hedgerows, and really it was dirt and hedgerows with the roots entrenched in those banks of dirt, channeled your movement and channeled the ability to control a line of access and a line of fire. So here we are back in England with nothing resembling that, and they're trying to train us to fight in the hedgerows. Again, it's the story of the Army fighting the last war. We didn't ever fight in the hedgerows again after we broke out of Normandy, but we spent a lot of time learning how to fire and maneuver in that sort of terrain. Unnecessary, but that's what we were doing. In September, I think what was one of the most interesting airborne operations that ever took place, Operation Market Garden, began on the 17th of September. It was the strategic plan was set up by General Montgomery, the British commander, and Monty persuaded Ike, General Eisenhower, that with the capture of 3 bridgeheads in Holland, I can't remember the names of all the towns, but one was at Nijmegen. I believe it was the furthest bridge, the bridge that was the bridge too far in literature. And the concept was that we would drop these 3 airborne divisions on the 3 bridgeheads over 3 rivers, capture the bridges, and a laser-like lightning attack of British armor would come up and would move up and take over from the airborne troops. Well, as history tells us, and as I learned later from reading history, Eisenhower thought this was a good concept. As a matter of fact, I think I read one historian that quoted Eisenhower as saying it was a brilliant concept, but it failed. And it failed because we couldn't capture and hold the 3rd bridge. The 82nd had charge for either the 1st or 2nd bridge. The 101st had charge of either the 1st or 2nd bridge. I don't know which division had charge of which bridge. And the British 1st Airborne, 1st or 6th? 1st Airborne Division had the responsibility for the bridge at Nijmegen. And that was tough. The 17th Airborne was supposed to be involved in that operation. I didn't know that at the time. They never said a word to us about anything that was happening. All we knew that on the 17th of September, the sky was absolutely filled with aircraft. I don't think I've ever seen as many airplanes in the air as I did on the 17th of September. It was a daytime drop, by the way. Normandy had been a nighttime drop. They did the day drop in Holland. And so you saw all the aircraft taking off from the British Isles to go up to Nijmegen and do that drop. But history tells us that it didn't work, and while we can't be quite sure why, there was always a great deal of speculation and discussion about the fact, well, if they'd had an American airborne division up there at that spearhead, we would have gotten up there quickly, and we would have been able to capture and hold that bridge. And also, if Patton had his tanks to go up and move into the 3 bridgeheads, again, the Americans could have done it. I think that's sheer speculation, and I don't have any idea that the outcome would have been any different. Again, the interesting point in my mind was that after it was clear that Nijmegen failed, they didn't get the airborne troops out of there. I go back to the fact that the doctrine said, once you've done your mission, you're going to be pulled back. The airborne troops stayed in Holland from the 17th of September until sometime in mid-November, the early to mid-November section. And they were then, those 2 divisions were then pulled back to...
You're speaking of the American divisions here.
Yes, the 2 American divisions. They were pulled back to billets in northern France. I had one interesting experience because the 513th Parachute Infantry and the 17th Airborne Division and many of the replacement officers in the 507th Regiment hadn't had any battle experience. They ferried some lieutenants and captains up to Holland and landed them and had them stay there with the 82nd and 101st for about a week. One time my number came up, and with 4 or 5 other officers, I was scheduled to go. We went to the airport, and the weather was good, and we just assumed it was a matter of time till we'd be taking off and going over to Holland for a week of indoctrination and orientation with the troops that were battle hardened. We sat there all day nothing happened. Finally, somebody came from the control tower, where we'd been sitting at the base of the control tower waiting for further orders, and said, "You're not going. Your flight has been canceled." So my first chance to be in a combat situation in late October or early November was scratched. And again, one of those mysteries of war, I don't have the slightest idea why. The next event was a move. We moved from the area around Nottingham out on the Winchester Plains, near Winchester, and I'm trying to think of the name of the area where we were, and I can't, but it was
Is it
near
Swindon?
Swindon, exactly right, thank you. It was near Swindon, and we were billeted there in an old British camp. Pretty good facilities, permanent camp pretty much, and we did a lot of work in the 507th under Lieutenant Colonel Timmies and Colonel Raff. Colonel Raff was always riding a bicycle around, checking up on people. He apparently liked bicycles, and I recall getting a mild reprimand from the colonel about the way I was handling some close order drill on a particular day, and I accepted that from the
This is tape 3, side B. And Bob, you were at Swindon, so
right up there. And I sort of described what we were doing. It wasn't anything heavy, just sort of maintaining. But I got a 3-day pass to London for my first visit to London on a Friday evening, then Saturday, and come back on Sunday on the train. When we got back to Swindon in our camp, the first thing Monday morning out of the box was that the Germans had started an attack in Belgium, in the Ardennes forest.
this is in December.
This is in December. December the 16th was the start of the actual attack by the Germans. The weather was terrible. We could not get any aircraft in the air. I think the Battle of the Bulge would have been a much less stressful operation had we had clear weather and we could have flown aircraft. I think we would have handled the Hitler's last thrust to try to win the war. His goal was to move through Belgium and get to the port of Antwerp, where we were moving supplies through. He failed, but at any rate, to get back to the Monday morning, the troops are called together, the regiment is called together, and we all stand together. Short little Colonel Raff is up on the head of the front of a Jeep, standing on the engine, on the bonnet, as the British would say, and he said, "Men, we're going into combat. We don't know exactly when, but we are going, and this is, you must understand, this is important because it's the last thrust of the German army. Will be their last big attack." He was right about that. But what happened was the weather worked against the 17th Airborne Division. Meanwhile, on the continent, the 82nd and 101st, many of whom had been on leave in Paris and elsewhere, were being called back to their billet up around Reims, France, and north of there, and they were being gotten ready for combat on the continent. Every day, we would, starting on Tuesday, we would march down to the airport near our billet, and we would...
This is in England.
This is in England.
Yeah.
I'm in England still. And we would march down, and we would sit around all day. But our instructions were, have everything that you want to take with you, or should take with you, or must take with you, everything ready to go, because we don't know which day we're going to go. The only thing we didn't have, parachutes. No parachutes. We knew then we were not going to make a drop, because when you make a drop, there has to be a lot of advanced planning. You have to study the terrain. You have to look at aerial photos. We did none of that, so we knew we were not going to make a parachute jump. In the winter, with bad weather, in the Ardennes, with snow on the ground, it's just not a suitable place to make a parachute drop. So we knew that something else was going to happen. What happened finally, on the 24th of December, the weather cleared. Actually, it cleared on the 23rd, and the Transport Command began to get aircraft into the air to resupply the 82nd, and particularly the 101st Airborne, which had been, by some accounts, surrounded at Bastogne. Although the men of the 101st claim to this day that they were never actually surrounded at Bastogne and could have held on forever there, despite Patton's arrival to bail them out. On the 24th of December, mid-afternoon, bright, shiny, pleasant day, after a lot of cloudy, dreary days, we boarded aircraft. The particular aircraft that I was assigned to as the jump master, although we weren't going to make a jump, didn't have a door on the aircraft. So I was able to stand in the door of the airplane and stick my head out and take a look. Now, you have to understand, we were flying at low altitude and we weren't flying very fast. But we flew across the British Channel, and again, because I could stick my head out the door of the aircraft, I could look around, and the sky was simply a blanket of airplanes. When we landed in Reims, near Reims at an airport, and began to descend, it was getting to be dusk, and planes were moving every which way in the air at every altitude. I marveled to this day that they were able to get that airborne division moved across the channel. My understanding is that they moved the entire 4 regiments, 2 glider regiments and 2 jump regiments across the channel in one day. I don't know that for a fact, but somebody told me that was the case. At any rate, Christmas Eve we got into trucks. We were driven through the night till maybe 1, 2 o'clock in the morning along in there to the camp where either the 82nd or 101st had been stationed before they were pulled up to reject the German attack in the Bulge. I think everybody knows it was called the Bulge because Patton didn't care for straight lines too much, but most of the other Army commanders sort of wanted a neat battlefield. Montgomery particularly wanted a neat, clean battlefield, but the American commanders did too. And when Hitler began his attack on the 16th, he created quite a salient through Belgium, through the Ardennes. Nobody would have thought he would attack through the Ardennes in the wintertime. It's tough terrain, and it's tree-covered terrain, and it's crisscrossed with some rivers and streams. It's not a good area for an attack, although other attacks had taken place through the Ardennes in other wars and earlier in World War II. At any rate, we end up in this camp. We're there one day. We have Christmas dinner there. It was the standard operating procedure, GI Christmas dinner, turkey, cranberries, potatoes and gravy, all the rest of it. We ate out of mess kits, most of us outside, but it was a bright day. There was snow on the ground, but it was bright and clear, but it was cold. And that evening, after dark, we're loaded on trucks again, and we move up to a town on the French-Belgian border. And I can't remember the name of that town, but it was a very small town. My company was billeted in a schoolhouse. We slept on the floor. By that time, we were eating C and K rations. We didn't. Airborne units don't have company kitchens. Regular infantry units have company kitchens. Airborne units have one kitchen per battalion. and we were no place close to our battalion kitchen. I have no idea where it was. It may not have even been moved over to northern France and to Belgium at that time. It may have stayed back in a rear echelon. I don't know. At any rate, we were eating C and K rations, which are potable, but not anything exclusive in the way of food. But we managed it on those, not only that first week, but for the entire 30 days that I was in combat, I ate nothing but C and K rations that whole time. But we were billeted in this school building and just holding fast. We were under fire, artillery, there was artillery fire and tank fire, but we weren't deployed in a position to react or respond to any of this. And of course, it was somewhat chaotic because the Germans had very cleverly adopted and adapted American uniforms and English-speaking Americans and American weapons and captured American vehicles and they moved all the roadsides around and so forth and so on as part of their attack. There was mass confusion in the area. You weren't sure what was happening. It was like San Francisco during the early days of World War II, right after Pearl Harbor. A lot of confusion. But we moved to this small town. The weather turned bad again. More snow, more gray, dreary days, more snow, more cold weather. January the 4th, we jumped off. We left the school.
This is 1945.
1945. We jumped off and went on the attack.
This is the counterattack after
Correct.
the defeat of the Germans
Correct.
in the Battle of Orleans.
Correct. By this time, Patton has gotten to Bastogne, relieved the 101st. That situation is secure. Incidentally, Patton wanted to, he had a concept of enveloping on the right and left flanks of the German salient and pinching them off and capturing them in the middle. But someone made a decision in the higher echelon of command that the effort was to be a pushback effort. And that's what the 17th was called on to do. Both the 82nd and 101st were in positions, holding positions now, not advancing extensively. And it was our job to make that pushback so that the salient moved back from the Meuse River and back to the original lines.
This is called Eisenhower's broad front strategy.
It was, that's exactly what it was. That is correct. And he employed that, and he employed a division which had some veterans in it from the 507th that had been in Normandy, but the rest of that division had not been in combat before. And so
this is your first real experience with combat.
Right. This is
your
really
own personal.
This is really the first time that I realized that there's a real war with people shooting bullets and screaming mimes and all the rest, and that this is serious business, and I better keep my head down and learn how to dig foxholes, which, by the way, I knew how to do, but was an impossibility. The soil was hard, so frozen so hard. I remember the first night after we'd moved out and into position to get into position for an attack. I tried to dig a foxhole with my entrenching tool. It was ludicrous. You could no more. The only way you were going to have a foxhole in that area was to take a grenade and set off a grenade and blow a hole, and that would have not have been a very wise thing to do. The weather was the second enemy. The Germans were tough enough, but the weather was the second enemy. And we weren't as well uniformed as we would like to have been. We left in quite a hurry. We had no overshoes. Excuse me, some men had no gloves. And that was not good. I remember one day an order came down from battalions, the company commanders, get the shoe size and the glove size of every man in your company and report it back to battalion on a list. And I thought, this is ludicrous. This is a waste of time. How in the world are they going to get these supplies to us? About 2 days later, here came some overshoes, not enough to outfit everybody, and gloves for anybody who didn't have gloves. Again, sort of one of those sort of miracles of the military, that they can come up with this and get it when they have to, the right place at the right time. My combat experience was interesting. I was not in a lot of firefights, but I was in a lot of places where there were firefights. I should say that, and I mentioned this earlier, I was the executive officer of Company E. My good friend Captain Case was the commanding officer of Company F. Casey got hit. He was wounded. And so they needed a replacement for Casey. So they moved me back. I'd been in F Company before. They moved me from E to F, and I'm now the company commander of F Company of the 507. That happened about the 9th of January.
That's of Company F.
That's right. I went to command of Company F. I'd been there before, but I'd gone away to E Company, and I came back to F, and I was the company commander. And I had a first sergeant who had had the Normandy experience. Sergeant Al Mazurkowitz, Albert Mazurkowitz, Mazurkowitz. He had been a sergeant on the New York Police Department, and Al was a great guy. And I mentioned sometime earlier in this interview about how sometimes enlisted personnel instruct and teach and orient officers. I got a lot of that from Al Mazurkowitz because he'd been in combat, he knew the score, and he and I got along well together, and he was of great service to me. He's since passed away, but I saw him on several reunions after the war and had a chance to tell him how much he'd done for me as a young lieutenant, first in a combat situation. We moved along, and I remember with some clarity moving to an area near Bastogne, a little town of Mandy Saint Etienne. That's Mandest, abbreviation, Mandy Saint Etienne, Etienne. And we moved across into that little village about 4 kilometers from Bastogne at nighttime, and we set up our company headquarters in a cowshed, which was open on one side, but it had a wall and some protection from the wind and the snow. And again, it was absolutely bitter cold, and snowing intermittently off and on throughout this entire period of time. We stayed there for a couple of days, and I moved the command post from the cowshed up to a foxhole area up on a ridge line and a wood line where we could look out with a good field of fire and good visibility to see who was approaching while we hunkered down in the woods. And we were in that defensive position for a while. And one day, I usually had a runner with me. We had radios, and sometimes, and in this instance, they actually got a wire up to us. The signal group managed somehow to get a wire up to the company CP, which was very unusual. But they did that time, although it worked intermittently. Our radios worked intermittently, so I always tried to have a runner with me. But one day I went up to check on one of the, and this was late morning, and I went up to check on a platoon position to see how things were going and check out the platoon leader and see how we were getting along. And Colonel Timmis, by the way, had visited me earlier at the command post. He was a battalion commander who got down to the company level with a high degree of frequency which was unusual amongst many battalion commanders, but he did. I'm walking along and I'm looking out. I'm walking through the woods on a little trail, and I'm looking out to the left down into a draw into low ground. We were on the higher ground, which is where you want to be. And I look across and I see two men walking across the open ground from a little copse of wood down in the draw. There's a little stream down there, and they were walking toward the woods where I was. I was armed with a carbine, a folding collapsible carbine was the only weapon that I carried. And I keep watching these men, and the reason I kept watching them is because I'm thinking, we didn't have any troops down there. Who are those men? They were two German soldiers, and neither of them was armed. I don't know what they were doing. They hadn't seen me. I saw them before they saw me because they were out in the open. I was back undercover, so I just let them come on, come on, come on. And when they got close, I'm in a kind of a crouched defensive position with my rifle, and I give them the German Hande hoch, hands over your head. And they understood and I captured my first and only two German prisoners that particular day. I ran them back to the CP and said, run them on back to battalion and see if they can do anything in the way of intelligence. I don't think they could. They looked to me like two starved, hungry kids that were having more trouble than I was having. And so I didn't feel that they needed any bad treatment, nor did I feel that they had any intelligence value. But I would never know because that was a matter not for my jurisdiction. A day or two later, we got an order to move out of that position. And we did, and we were told to meet at an assembly point. The battalion was going to be moving, and all the troops got there on time. F Company was the last company to arrive, but we met the time of departure. We were there on schedule, and we started walking. And it started snowing. And we walked, and it snowed, and it was cold. And we walked all day that day, and we walked into the night. We marched. And we never had any enemy contact. We saw small spotter aircraft in the air, no attack aircraft of any kind. These were artillery, I assume artillery planes. They looked like Piper Cubs, which is what the artillery used. So we didn't think, and I didn't think, we were under any danger of attack at that particular time. And we kept moving. And finally, about 8 or 9 o'clock at night, I realized that except for a pit stop or two to relieve the troops, and let the troops relieve themselves, would probably be a better way to put that, we hadn't had a chance to eat anything. So I go up to the battalion exec who's up at the head of the column, and by that time we're down in a ravine wandering around off of the road. And I say, Major Smith, these men have had nothing to eat all day. And he said to me, Mott, when you have them on the move, you keep on the move. I went back to my F Company men, and we continued to march. I have no idea how far we moved, but that was probably one of the most extensive, rapid movements that we made during the whole Battle of the Bulge. Just a couple of other instances.
Really, the after battle, the battle after the battle.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
And there were times when we were under enemy rifle fire and enemy small arms fire, and we were and the German artillery didn't do much, but they had what was an 88 millimeter weapon. I think we called it the Screaming Mimi. It made the most god-awful sound I've ever heard, and we heard a lot of those. I don't know what else to say about my combat experience except that As we moved along through the month, we made good progress. We kept pushing back. I was never in any extreme firefights where I saw a lot of people get hit or wounded, and yet there were people being hit and wounded all about me. My best friend, who was the signal officer in the 2nd Battalion headquarters, was hit early on, and I mentioned Captain Case, and we lost enlisted personnel, but there was never a pitched battle where we were firing at them and they were firing with us, with one exception, and that was, if you can want to call it a highlight, that's not the right word, but that was the one time when I felt extreme pressure of being under fire. We slept outside. I never had any hot food except that which we cooked on our C and K rations over Bunsen burners that we had. I never changed clothes in the whole 30 days that I was in combat, from the time we left on the 4th of January. As a matter of fact, longer than that. I never had a change of clothes after we left England until I went into the hospital. And
okay, I'll let you continue, but you went into the hospital.
I
guess maybe we're not there yet. So.
Well, that was the time when, for the first time since I'd been in a combat situation, that I had a change of clothes from my dirty old clothes into a hospital gown. How did I get in the hospital is probably the question we need to answer. And it went this way. As I said, I never was in water. My feet were never wet. But as time went on, because I had no overshoes, my feet began to, I began to experience frostbite. My feet began to turn black, my toes and the bodies of my feet. Not extensive, but it was bad. One day we're in a column. We've been in Houffalize, Belgium. That's Houffalize, Houffalize, a lovely little resort town on a river.
Would you spell it again, please?
Yeah, Houffalize, Houffalize, Belgium. We're marching through this town. The town, there isn't a building in this town that's intact. That town had been totally destroyed. And we're marching through Houffalize, and later that day we are hooked up with some British troops. So we now have two columns. We have paratroopers on either side of the road moving along, and we have British soldiers, not airborne soldiers, but other British soldiers intermixed in the columns, so that we had 4 columns of people moving up the sides of the road, keeping the middle of the road clear for vehicular access, which was the customary way that you did these things. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, the Brits stopped on a dime at 4 p.m. and had tea. And they just stopped. Their column just stopped. No, I don't know if anybody gave them a command. They dug out their little Bunsen burners and their tea bags, and they fired them up, and they sat there and stopped their march by the side of the road as we trudged on. And a thought crossed my mind, and maybe it was terribly unsoldierly and unpatriotic, but I thought, you know, we're over there helping the Brits, helping them win this war, and they're stopping for tea, and we're trudging on, and we're moving ahead. I thought, that is a ridiculous way to fight a war. We shouldn't do that. So we got into a town, and I've tried to locate this town on a map, and I've never been able to do so. I thought the name of the town was Schmidt, S-C-H-M-I-D-T, but I've never been able to find out exactly where I was. But I said to myself, okay, if the Brits can stop for tea at 4 in the afternoon, I got the company positioned in a defensive position in the village, the battalion was all set in. I went down to the battalion aid station, and I said, "You got to do something for these feet." And they took one look at the feet and said, "You're out of here." And I must admit that was a surprise to me. I didn't go to be evacuated. I didn't expect to be evacuated. But somebody made a judgment that I should be evacuated. So I told the battalion exec. They said, "Leave your rifle and leave your carbine in the aid station." And the battalion exec was pretty damned unhappy with me. I said, "Major, I don't want to go, but you have to understand the medical officer said I was to go." So that's 8, 9 o'clock at night. An ambulance pulls up, 3 or 4 of us, all ambulatory, load into the ambulance, and we take off. I have no idea where, except we end up in an old, not old particularly, a deserted school building type of vehicle. And I get out of the back of the ambulance, and there's a medical officer there, and some enlisted personnel, and the medical officer says, there's a scrawny little kid there, and the medical officer says to me, "Get on his back." And I said, "I can walk. I'm okay. I'm ambulatory. I can walk." He said, "Get on his back." So that was my introduction to the Army Medical Service. This young kid carried me up a flight of stairs up to a second store area where he put me in a bed, and I was sick. I had diarrhea, and I was dirty and cold and clammy, but most importantly, my feet were in really bad shape. I had cut a hole in my left boot about the size of a quarter to relieve some of the pressure and the tension. Otherwise, I couldn't get my boot on. And so I'd done that. I thought I'd done about all that I could before I went to the aid station. I'm sure there are some who would say, "Mott, you chickened out." I don't know. That's the decision I made, and that's how I got into the medical system. A few days in that hospital after I got over the diarrhea, got cleaned up a little bit. They didn't do any treatment for my feet except to keep them uncovered, totally uncovered. I was moved again by ambulance to another hospital near Nancy, France, which was a pretty decent hospital, and a lot of different soldiers getting pretty good medical care in that facility. And I remember a medical officer coming down the line of beds one morning on an inspection, and he looked at me, looked at my chart, and he said, "We'll probably have to amputate." And to this day, I do.
Bob, we were to the point where you had been evacuated because of frostbite in your feet and had been told that possibly you were facing amputation. You pick up there?
I can. A few days after that discussion, it wasn't a discussion, it was just a statement by the doctor, there was no more discussion of amputation, and I was put on a hospital train that went from Nancy through Paris to the port, Bordeaux. Is that the right port?
Well,
near Normandy. It was the first port that was captured after the Bulge. The first time after the Bulge that we captured a seaport. And I was put on a British hospital ship. German prisoners of war carried me from the train on a gurney, a stretcher, to the hospital ship, and they kept trying to cover up my feet, and I kept trying to tell them, "No, don't cover up my feet, because that's the way it's supposed to be." I got on board the hospital ship. We go across the English Channel on another hospital train. I go to an American U.S. Army hospital near Oxford, outside of Oxford. And that was a first-class hospital. And that's when I first began to get some actual effort to do something to improve my condition. All the other places had just been a holding pattern to evacuate me along to the point. All they did, by the way, for frostbite, as far as treatment was concerned, was to keep your feet and legs exposed and to feed you lemon juice and medicinal alcohol. And I drink a lot of lemon juice and medicinal alcohol. Some of it scheduled and some of it unscheduled. Because if there were any spare, the nurse would let us go up into the bomb shelter and sit in the bomb shelter and drink more medicinal alcohol as long as we didn't make a lot of noise and kept quiet. Supposedly, this was to help restore the circulation. Not much happened in the hospital, except that one day I was told, you're going to get a 3-day pass to visit your sister. I said, what sister? They said, the sister that's in the wax. I said, I have 3 sisters in the wax. Do you know which sister it is? They didn't really know, but they said, one of your sisters is at an air base in Wales. The Red Cross has arranged for her to come to Oxford to visit. So, sure enough, my sister, 2 years older than I, Marjorie, was in the U.S. Army Air Corps, and she was stationed at a base in Wales. She came over to Oxford. We had a nice 3-day visit. By that time, I could get a boot back on again, and it was the highlight, and it was the first contact that I had with any of my family. In late March, I'm sitting there thinking, well, gee, I'm about ready to go back to duty, and I'm ready to go, and the nurse comes in and says, you're being evacuated to the States, you're going home. I said, I can't believe that. I don't particularly want to go. She said, don't be foolish. She said, the reason they're evacuating you is because there's going to be another big action and the hospitals are going to be filling up again. She said, that's why they're emptying them out. So, sure enough, in late March, I aboard the USS Washington, a hospital ship, and it moved slowly across the Atlantic with many patients, some mental cases, which I remember. Some of were ambulatory, but most were stretcher borne. We landed in Boston, and for the first time in 11 months or so, I see lights at night. We stay up all night, literally, just looking at the lights of Boston Harbor. Go to Camp Miles Standish, outside of Boston. We're processed.
When did you get back to Boston?
On the
Was it April 12th?
no, it wasn't April 12th.
I'm sorry.
April
Okay,
12th, a little bit later on.
Okay, okay, got back to Boston.
Yeah, we got back to Boston, and I'll give you an approximate date.
Well, it's not necessary. I
Okay.
thought maybe it was April 12th.
No, it wasn't. It was after. It was before that, and it was in early April. We went to Miles Standish, and they asked us what we'd like to be hospitalized. I said I'd like Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C., because when I'd been on maneuvers in Tennessee at one time earlier in my airborne experience, I'd met a young student at Vanderbilt, and we became attracted to each other, and I'd kept in touch with her to some degree, and she had gone to Washington to do war work in some part of the military establishment. So I wanted to see her, and they said, don't be foolish, the only people we send to Walter Reed Hospital are people who have mental situations or need brain surgery or that kind of treatment. That's a very sophisticated hospital. So why don't you think about somebody closer to home, somewhere closer to home? I said, any place in Colorado? Yes, Fort Carson. I said, good. So I went to Fort Carson, Colorado, and was in the hospital there, went through the usual processing. And shortly after I'd been there a few days, I'm given a 30-day leave to go home, a recuperative leave. I can go home. So I'm glad that I'm going to be back in Emporia. So I go to the train station in Colorado Springs and buy a ticket to Emporia, and having some spare time on my hand, on the 11th of April, I go into a bar, the Antlers Bar, in the Antlers Hotel, which is near the railroad station, and I walk into the bar, and who do I see in the bar but my best military friend, Louis Sponsler. And Spons, S-P-O-N-S-L-E-R, Louis, L-E, he spells his name L-E-W-I-S, Louis Sponsler. He was a Kansas boy. His dad managed theaters in Fort Scott for the Fox chain in and around Kansas. But he'd gone to military school and had gotten married before he went overseas. So he was in the hospital at Carson recuperating from his wounds. His mother was there, his wife was there, and Louis was there. And needless to say, we had one tremendous reunion. I had not met his mother before, but we had a chance to be with his wife before, and so it was a great reunion. I missed my train that day on the 11th. I drank too much and missed the train and stayed overnight, and the next day was the 12th of April, and I got on the Santa Fe train from Colorado Springs to Emporia. I don't remember whether I took a cab home or walked I probably took a cab from the station up to 202 West 13th Avenue, and I knock on the door. My mother greets me at the door, and I'm expecting her to say such things as, "I'm really glad to see you," or "Thank God you're home," or "You're home again," or whatever. The first words out of her mouth were, "President Roosevelt has died." So that's a date I've never forgotten. Roosevelt had died. I'm home 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. His death has occurred in the east around noontime, and that's my welcome home. I spent 30 days in Emporia. I loaf around the radio station a lot and keep looking at the news wire. They were kind enough to let me walk in and check the news wire to see what was happening in the world, the Associated Press news ticker. I started to take flying lessons. I went down to the airport south of Emporia and got into a Piper Cub and had some instruction in flying an aircraft. And I just fiddled around and, got acclimated with the world again. Went back out to Carson, got another 30-day leave. The point was I wasn't physically ready for a combat situation, but I was all right, except that had I been forced to run or to use my feet extensively, I wouldn't have been able to hack it. Make a long story short, that pattern sort of continued until late August, or more likely early September, late August. And after you were released from the hospital, they sent you to what they called an R&R post, a rest and recreation post. The Army had taken over most of the hospitals in Hot Springs, Arkansas. You'd go down to Hot Springs, you'd be in a nice little hotel situation, have a room all your own, in a hotel accommodation. They'd check you out, check your dental records, check your physical condition again, check all your pay records, all the rest of it. You went through the rigmarole, and they gave you nice pieces of steak to take out in the woods and barbecue, and they had a few nice young women around that would go with you, and you'd have a chance to visit with them. It was just a transition chance that happened. Well, of course, by that time the bomb had been dropped in Japan, and so I know I'm going to get out of the service. And sure enough, they finished processing me in Hot Springs and sent me to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where I am officially separated from the service on the 17th of September 1945, although I had terminal leave coming, which kept me on status until the 7th of December 1945. And thus ends my description of my active duty in World War II.
All right, let's pause for a few moments and let me ask you this. You can now look back on your experience in World War II from the perspective of 60 years and perhaps compare it with what it was at that time. As you look back on it, what is your attitude toward America's involvement in World War II?
Well, I'd like to state first my personal involvement, my personal thought about it, and that is that it was a great experience, and I'm glad I experienced it, but I never want to go through anything else like it ever again, or have anybody else go through it again. I thought we had to fight that war. There was no question in my mind at all that that was a just war. It was a war with a purpose, with a cause, that the world would be totally different today had the Allied forces not prevailed over Germany and Japan. I had no quarrel at any time with the political decisions that were made to federalize the Guard, to set up the draft, to do all the things that they had to do with the economy and with rationing and all the other sacrifices that were made to win that war. I did not have a problem with it. It was something that I was just expected to do, and I expected to do it, and I'm glad that I did a little bit that I did. I think our involvement in that war was entirely appropriate.
What was your opinion of America's political and military leaders in that war?
Well, I'm a Democrat, and my father was a Democrat. I mentioned earlier in this interview that he was one of six or seven brothers, and he was the only Democrat in the bunch. So obviously, when Roosevelt became president, we were delighted. We were delighted not because he was a Democrat, but because what we saw in our political leadership was a president who was going to try to do something to bring the country out of the Depression and to bring it along, even in 1932 when he was first elected. So I was highly impressed with Roosevelt. As a matter of fact, one of my tasks in England was to be the voting officer for the elections in 1944, and I worked vigorously to get as many soldiers as I could to vote in the November elections in 1944 as I possibly could. It was a difficult task because it had never been done before, and we had to deal with a variety of states, so it was tough. But you know, the political posture that the America, the United States, and its allies adopted for World War II was fine with me. I would put a stamp of approval on all of it.
Did you equally approve of President Truman?
Well, I thought Roosevelt was a greater leader, but I'm a Harry Truman supporter. I think he took over under adverse circumstances. He was sort of out of the loop, as we say, on information. So I understand that he didn't know about the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb. But if for no other reason, that both Harry Truman and I were good Southwest Missouri boys of different age groups, to be sure. For no other reason, he made the decision to use the atomic bomb. And I know the atomic bomb was a horrible thing. I read John Hershey's little book on Hiroshima and what happened to 6 people who were killed, or not killed, but wounded in that, damaged in that bombing. And that's a tragic, sad story, which I hope never has to be repeated. But he, I would say, Truman, in effect, I think, saved my life in the sense that Japanese invasion, which was planned for the fall of 45, along, I believe, in October and November, that didn't happen, and because it didn't happen, I was not put in jeopardy again. Now, who knows whether I would have been killed in the invasion of France. All I know is I was sure I was going to be back in a combat situation again.
You expected to be sent to the Pacific
I
Theater.
expected to be sent, and I understood why I would have been sent. I had a little bit of battle experience, I had a lot of leadership experience, and I fully expected to be sent to the Pacific Theater, no question about it, and to be a part of the invasion of Japan. I just assumed it was going to happen.
Looking back on the Depression and the war, obviously in the 1930s, America had gradually moved from a position of isolation to heavy involvement in the world, and that heavy involvement continues at the present time. What is your view of the way America is presently conducting its foreign policy?
Well, it's certainly different than it was during World War II. And I am reluctant to be critical with limited knowledge of national leadership. I wish I knew more about what was happening. But based on the information that I gather from my reading and listening to the radio, watching television, I've concluded that in a way we've almost become isolationist again. Now, during the World War II, Charles Lindbergh and some other folks made an effort toward isolating the United States, and I didn't like that at the time. I thought that was wrong, even though we supposedly had these two great collective bodies of water, the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, which would protect our shores, and we would be perfectly okay if we did go isolationist. But I have seen the world come together. It's grown smaller and smaller because of my work in communications. I've seen how now we can get information and send information back and forth to all the corners of the earth. We know much more about what is happening. Commerce is happening. And so the world is getting closer together, and as Tom Friedman says in his book, the world is getting flat. We're leveling out. I don't think our current policies take account for that. We don't have, President Bush the first did a pretty good job of getting the Allies together for the first war in Iraq after the invasion of Kuwait. But I think the present administration has not recognized the need for America to be better accepted throughout the world.
Is that what you mean by the isolationist? We are isolating ourselves from the rest of the world, that they're not really with us.
That's what I think is happening because of our policies and our procedures. We don't intentionally have a policy of isolation. It's not an isolationist policy. But I think the policies that we do have, indicating that we can go it alone and we don't really need your help, and if you don't do it our way, it's the highway, and all of those elements and facets of the current administrative policy, I think is causing us to become one of the most hated worlds, or at least, let me rephrase that, not one of the most hated worlds, one of the most hated countries in the world, and if not hated, then certainly disliked, and drawing together a group of allies such as we had in World War II would be virtually impossible now. So I'm not enthusiastic about our current situation, nor the way that the war in Iraq has been prosecuted.
Well, we come down toward the end here. I know, of course, that this is not
when you left the service at that end of the war, that was not the end of your military service. Can you give us a quick overview of
I can.
what your military service has consisted of since that time?
When I got back in Emporia and went back to finish up my education at Emporia State University, and incidentally, if I had an overriding thought in my mind throughout my entire military career, it was to get back home to Emporia and graduate from KSTC. I think that thought, I didn't think as much about family and I didn't have any great love life, great romances going. I just wanted to get back and be a civilian again and be a college student again and get that degree. But after I came back, after I got off of active duty, I was assigned to the active reserve. And a year or so after I got back and was still in school and finishing up, I got an opportunity to join the Kansas National Guard. And Kansas National Guard now had another Company B post-war of the 137th Infantry.
The one you'd started with.
The one I started out with. And I go back, and I'm now a first lieutenant, and the commanding officer, whose name I can't recall, finished up his tour. I took over as a first lieutenant, company commander, Company B, 137th Infantry, still meeting in the same old armory where I had had my first drills in the late 30s and early 40s. And I got promoted to captain in the Kansas National Guard, and I continued in the Guard until I left the state of Kansas and moved to La Junta, Colorado. We did do one period of 2 weeks active duty training. We went by train again from Emporia to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, and had two pretty good weeks down there. And the troops were bright young chaps, again a lot of students from Emporia State, and I had a good 2-week tour down there. When I got out to Colorado, I was in the reserve but inactive, and stayed in that mode for a year or so, and left La Junta to go to Denver to become a graduate student at the University of Denver. That would have been 1949, and I'm sort of casting about, thinking I'd kind of like to get out of the infantry. I've been there, done that, and maybe there's another berth someplace. So a couple of students say to me, they know that I had some military experience. They say to me, we belong to a military intelligence unit. This was at the time of the Korean War. And I said, oh, I said, I don't have any intelligence experience. They said, well, you don't need any. You ought to come out and see Captain Holmes, a commanding officer. He can probably find a place for you. So I go out to an armory in Denver and meet Captain Holmes, introduced by these two young enlisted men, students of mine. And Holmes says, we really don't have any vacancies except in a Serbo-Croatian language team. Do you speak Serb or Croat language or whatever other language would be appropriate for that? I said, are you kidding? No. He said, well, let's sign you up for that, and we'll find another slot for you. So I signed on as a captain with this military intelligence unit, and later an opening occurred in their aerial photography interpretation area. So I became an interpreter of aerial photos. We went to camp a couple of times, Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, and we went someplace else, and I can't remember where it was. Might have been Fort Carson. And I was promoted a couple of times from captain to major, and then major to lieutenant colonel. And when I left Colorado and went to Washington State University in Pullman, Washington, I was a major, and I got promoted to lieutenant colonel, and I stayed in the active reserve and took training without pay in Spokane. So I drove 80 miles every Monday night to Spokane to attend a training class so I could get points toward retirement, and I did that. I went through the Command and General Staff School course, spending 2 or 3 summers at Fort Leavenworth for 2 weeks and doing correspondence work. So I'm a graduate of the Command and General Staff College. But in general, my military career, for all practical purposes, ended in 1966 when I retired from the Ready Reserve, the Army Reserve.
That you stayed on for in the
I did.
on the retired reserve.
I stayed on in retired status
Till when?
1980.
Okay. You never went back on active duty.
No.
Again.
No.
Now let's. I believe did receive some military decorations from your service during the war.
That is true, and I'll talk about them briefly. And I received 4 that I just want to mention. When you go through jump school, you're a parachutist, so you get your parachute wings, and that's an honorable thing to do. And that was a volunteer force at the time, and I think still is. So I was proud of that accomplishment. When you're in combat and under fire, as I was, you're entitled to a combat infantryman's badge, and I was very proud of that, and I felt as though I earned that. I also received the Purple Heart and a Bronze Star, and I'd like to comment about those briefly and say, first of all, I'm not sure that I deserved either one. And here's my rationale for that. Let's take the Bronze Star first. That's a pretty high decoration in the chain of decorations, and I didn't do anything heroic to earn a Bronze Star. But somebody in the military hierarchy, I think it was President Truman, made a decision that anybody who had received the Combat Infantryman's Badge also should receive a Bronze Star. So now there's a Bronze Star for valor, people who really did something worthwhile, and on the other hand, those who received the Bronze Star for valor. Just received the Bronze Star because you'd been in combat as an infantryman. I was not really entitled to a Bronze Star except by the fact that somebody decided that combat infantry personnel should have it. On the Purple Heart, I never thought much about it. I thought about it to the point that I didn't think I was entitled to one. I never inquired about it. Matter of fact, I never inquired about any of my medals or tried to get any of my medals until about 10 years ago when people began sort of nagging at me and say, you really ought to do that. So I never thought I was entitled to a Purple Heart. But the Purple Heart came about this way. When I was down at Fort Smith, Arkansas, the medical officer who was processing me and going through my papers had me describe to him the frostbite, which had been indicated as moderate was the word, moderate frostbite. And I said to him, I have no idea whether it was extreme or moderate or just common old frostbite. He said, you're entitled to a Purple Heart. And he told a clerk there to fill out a document, and he signed it saying that I was entitled to a Purple Heart. That's how I got that, and I'm not embarrassed by it, but I'm not particularly proud of the fact that I did anything to get a Purple Heart. So that's sort of the story of the 4 awards that I got, 2 of which I know I deserved, and 2 of which I must say were granted to me by the Army without any effort on my part to obtain them.
This is tape 4, side B, the Mott interview. And Bob, we want to wind this up now, so I would ask you to give us a brief sketch of your very extensive civilian career, so that we can
Brevity is one of the necessities of good journalism, you know, accuracy, brevity, clarity. Let me see how brief I can be here. Graduated from the University of Denver with a master's degree and taught there for a couple of years after I got the master's.
Of course, you went back to Emporia State and graduated.
I did. I mentioned that previously, but I graduated from Emporia State in January of '47. Stayed here in Emporia till the fall of '48. Went to La Junta, Colorado, and managed a commercial radio station there for a year, which had a connection with the University of Denver. I won't go into it except to say the station in La Junta was used as a small market training station for communications majors at the University of Denver. After a year at that station, I realized I needed to know a lot more, so I went to Denver, started working on my master's, got it in a couple of years, left after teaching for 2 more years. In 1953, I went to Pueblo, Colorado, and became the news director of the KGHF, the ABC radio station in Pueblo, who also was a half ownership in a television station that operated in Pueblo and Colorado Springs. And I did very little television work, primarily radio station work for a couple of years. Came along, I had 2 opportunities simultaneously. One was to go to Denver to become the news director of the ABC affiliate in Denver, KVOD, and at the same time, the dean of the School of Journalism at KU had heard me do some work while he was vacationing in Colorado, and he had heard some of my newscasts, and he got in touch with me and asked me if I would like to join the faculty at the University of Kansas. So I had a decision to make. I went back to KU for the interview. Lawrence one summer day, one summer weekend. It was 107 degrees in Kansas, and that and some other factors caused me to opt for the Denver news director's job. Took that job. It went well for a while. There was a change in ownership, and as often happens in the broadcasting business, when there is a change in ownership, they did a house cleaning. And that's the first time, the only time in my life, I was basically fired from a job. Not because I've done anything wrong, but they wanted their own people in those positions. So I'm casting about a bit. I had friends who had been in the radio operation with me in Trinidad and La Junta, Colorado, and they had gone on to Washington State University, then the State College of Washington in Pullman, Washington. And that school had one of the first educational radio stations in the country. And it also had a distinguished background in that Everett R. Murrow, the great CBS broadcaster during World War II, the voice of World War II on commercial radio for CBS, was a graduate of that school. So they had a nice culture there. So they needed an instructor and a writer. So in 1956, after I finished my work at the radio station in Denver, I moved to Pullman, Washington as an instructor in journalism and was involved both in the radio station operation and teaching journalism courses. And I stayed there for 12 years. And I had a nice career. I moved from an instructor to a full professorship with tenure in a matter of 12 years, which was quite a surprise to me. And I also became the manager of the radio television services, which had not only the AM radio station, but we also activated a public television station, KWSU. The name had been changed from the State College of Washington to Washington State University. So I had a responsibility there, sort of a command responsibility, a management responsibility for 12 years. I was pretty content there, except I didn't have the terminal degree. I didn't have a PhD, and I realized academically I was sort of stuck, and I was stuck in a pretty nice place. I realized it might get a little monotonous doing that for the rest of my life, and that I probably didn't have many new opportunities to advance. Suddenly, out of the blue, comes an opportunity. I got a call from a friend of mine in San Diego who asked me if I would be interested in going back to Washington, D.C. to become the executive director of National Educational Radio. NER, National Educational Radio, was one segment of the National Association of Educational Broadcasters, the NAEB. The NAEB had four branches. It had the aforementioned radio branch. It had a branch for educational television stations. It had an education branch because education by communications was supposed to be the big thing. And it had a special project branch which did a great project down in American Samoa. So I was intrigued with the opportunity in that job. So after some negotiation, I moved. I left my professorship at Washington State, and in the summer of 1968, we moved from Pullman, Washington, to Washington, D.C. That was culture shock. That was the year when they had in the spring the early riots. Robert Kennedy had been killed. Martin Luther King had been killed. The world was not at ease with itself in 1968. Many people told me you're crazy to go back to Washington, D.C. in this climate. But we went, and in 1967, the Public Broadcasting Act had been passed as one of Lyndon Johnson's last pieces of legislation in the Great Society. And so what was educational radio and television all of a sudden was public radio and television, and was really ready to take off and to have a great time, and they did. And I stayed with that radio job and helped get National Public Radio started. I was a candidate for the presidency of National Public Radio, but I didn't get the job. I was the runner-up. So, salving my wounds and feeling sorry for myself a couple of weeks, I began to cast about, and again, somebody that knew me and knew my work got in touch with me and introduced me to somebody that didn't know me or know anything about my work, and that was the second in command at the Public Broadcasting Service, PBS, the station that operates public television in the country. And after a couple of interviews,
I believe that's the agency rather than the station, am I correct? PBS is the agency.
That's correct, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It is an agency. It's an enterprise. It's a service organization. And anyway, I became the director of station relations at PBS and was there for 4 years and felt that while things had gone well in the incubation of PBS and NPR, that I sort of wanted to get out of Washington and back to the West. We'd been there about 10 years in all by this time, and so I began casting about for something else to do. And a former student of mine at the University of Vintner was engaged in a satellite technology project which was being managed by NASA and the then Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And he needed somebody who had good relations with public television stations. I was that person. But I had to understand that if I took that job, it was only going to last for a year, because that would be the end of the experiment with the NASA satellites in some health and education projects involving the Veterans Administration and the Alaska Health Service and some other educational projects that I don't need to get into. But I signed on anyway because I saw it as being on the cutting edge of technology. That project did end. The satellite went off to India, loaned to India by the State Department, and so I'm at loose ends. So one of the things I do, since I have nothing else to do, is to take a tour with Company B of the 137th Infantry to go back to Europe, to London, and to all the points where Company B had gone through Europe to the Elbe River.
Of course, you weren't with them at that time, but you will be with them now.
That's the point. I was not with them at the time, but I had that opportunity to go back and hear all these people talk about their experiences. Tom Tholen was there. There were some other people that were there that I knew well, and it was a great experience to have happened in my life. But while I'm there on that trip, we went to Berlin, And as the bus pulls up in front of the hotel, they come to the bus and say, Herr Mott has a phone call. And it's a phone call to say that while this federally sponsored program has ended, the outcome of that is going to be to form a consortium called the Public Service Satellite Consortium, which NASA is initially going to fund because NASA has a responsibility for research and development and applications. And they discovered that the nonprofit public service sector wasn't picking up on communication satellites. So they created this little organization of 35 or 40 people, and our job was to sell satellite communications to the nonprofit public service community throughout the United States. I was director of operations at first, and then I became the executive vice president, working under two great bosses, one in San Diego, and later it was decided to move the headquarters out of San Diego to Washington, D.C. So I hopped back to Washington, D.C. for 4 years and worked with a brilliant woman president of the consortium, and stayed 4 years there, realized it was time for me to retire. And the motivating factor in my retirement was that one of the instructions that I was given, jobs I was given, tasks I was assigned to for our staff in Washington and a staff in Denver was to get the organization computerized. And I didn't really want to do that in my early 60s, between 60 and 65. I just didn't want to take that mission on. But I found a smart woman on the staff who knew how to do this. And so I became a friend of hers, and I said, I want you to keep me out of trouble on this and keep me out of it. And I said, I want a computer on everybody's desk except mine. And that's sort of the way my career ended. I managed to get the system up and operating, but I wasn't a part of it. And I resigned in February of 1984. And that was the end of my professional career.
I have only one further question to ask you. Tell us a little bit about your family.
My family.
I mean your wife,
my
descendants, and so forth.
Right. My family.
Because we don't want to leave them out.
No, we do not want to leave them out, and the reason we don't want to leave them out is because I told you the story of meeting the two sisters in Kansas City to go dancing. And I'm so glad that you asked me about that, because when I got out of the service in 45, I discovered that one of the girls that I was supposed to go dancing with lived just around the corner off of 13th Street on Center Street, and she was now a student at KSTC and had pledged Sigma Sigma Sigma, but was living at home with her mother and father. They had moved here from Florence, Kansas. Her mother and father were in the grocery business in Florence, and when they moved to Emporia, their names were Homer McCready, M-C-C-R-E-A-D-Y, and Minta, M-I-N-T-A, McCready. And Homer McCready, Edith May McCready is my wife's name, which she isn't terribly excited about, the Edith May, particularly the May portion of it, M-A-E. When they moved to Emporia, her parents, the mother became a retail sales clerk at Newman's department store and other department stores here in Emporia back in the days when Commercial Street was really the place. And Edie's father became a salesman for the Fanistal Packing Company, which I understand still has a plant down, still has a product that they're distributing in this territory. But he traveled a lot around the Fanistal territory selling their meat products.
And you have been married ever since, I take it?
Ever since.
And when, I say since when, though?
Oh, since when? since August the 4th of 1946 in the Methodist Church at 9th and Merchant. I don't have the slightest idea who the presiding reverend was, but we were married in that church. We lived in the Union Building.
Now this is interesting. You lived in the Union
We
Building.
lived in the Student Union Building on the Emporia State University campus. They had a vets village up around 15th and Merchant, which are old buildings that they'd moved in to house vets and their families. But for some reason, Edie and I got assigned a one-room apartment, a one room with a bathroom adjacent to it. We had a hot plate in the place, and of course we could eat in the Union. We ate out some, but not very much because we didn't have much money. But as long as we were students, from August of 1946 until we graduated in January 47, we were up in that third floor room near where the bulletin offices now are located, on the front of the Union Building, up on the third floor.
Right over the veterans room.
That's right over what is now the veterans room. And I worked at the local radio station. We went to school. I did news and sports with Vic Peck. And after we finished school, housing was difficult to find in Emporia, and we moved to a boarding house or an apartment house on Union Street near 6th Avenue, and we lived up on the third floor in a one room, but it was a big room, and we shared a bathroom. Edie's father didn't think much of that, so he made an arrangement with a friend of his who was traveling for Edie and me to house sit their house out on the west side, what was then the west side of Emporia. It was the Findlay house. We knew Lee Findlay was the owner. His wife had passed away. His son was an Emporia State student who later went to the Naval Academy, Bert Findlay, and had a good, successful military career. And so we set the house for a while, and Lee would just come home on the weekend. So we had pretty much the run, and that was a nice accommodation, of course. But we wanted to get on our own, so we moved to a newly renovated set of apartment buildings along Merchant Street, between 8th and 9th on the east side of the street. They had refurbished those, and they were pretty nice, and it was close to the radio station, so we moved there and lived there. Edie and I have been married for 60 years as of August 4th, 2006, and of course, like any married couple, have had our ups and downs. We didn't do much for the population explosion. Our daughter, Allison Mott Duke, now Allison Mott, M-O-T-T, Duke, D-U-K-E, came along 14 years after Edie and I were married. We'd started adoption proceedings, and all of a sudden Edie is pregnant, which was great news for us. We were happy about that. That was when we were in Pullman, and Allison was born in Pullman. Shortly thereafter, a few years after we left Pullman, she was born in 1960, and we left Pullman in '68. So we moved to Montgomery County. So Allison was our only daughter, and she married not early in life, but somewhat late in life. And she married a mortgage banker in Upland, California, named Steve Duke. And Steve, to my regret, is a staunch Republican, but he's still a very nice guy. And I love Steve with all my heart, except he just doesn't understand the political world.
Why is it that we Democrats always have Republicans for son-in-laws?
I don't know. I don't know. But and they have one grandchild.
You have one grandchild.
Edie and I have one grandchild. They have one child, right?
Yeah.
Let's get that right. And that child was born on November the 30th, 2000. She'll be 6 years old November 30th of this year. So that's the family. A daughter, son-in-law, and a great-granddaughter, and they're all great people, and we love them with all our hearts, and we're just happy that it's been a good life for us.
Well, I think, Bob, it's time to wind this up due to the fact you were here visiting with your wife, because she is at a sorority reunion that you're having. That's why you're in town, and you are due at Cottonwood Falls for dinner. So I'm going to let you go.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to do this, Loren. I appreciate it more than you know.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
I gotta see what I gotta do.